Hello, awesome third graders. Today we're going to read chapter 13 through 15 in the Toothpaste Millionaire. But first, let's talk about our standards. What should you be able to say you can do? Our first standard says, I can describe characters in a story and explain how their actions contribute to the sequence of events. Our next standard says, I can determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, distinguishing literal from non-literal language. And finally, our last standard, I can compare and contrast the themes, settings, and plots of stories written by the same author about the same or similar characters. There are several economic standards for social studies. Let's focus on these three. First, we can describe the interdependence of consumers and producers of goods and services. We can describe how goods and services are allocated by price in the marketplace. And we can describe the opportunity costs and benefits of personal spending and saving choices. Now let's move on to our vocabulary words. We have 3 vocabulary words today. Your first word is chamber. It is a noun, and it is part of the machine that holds the toothpaste. As you can see in the picture, that is a chamber. So that is the part that's going to hold the toothpaste. Chamber. Our second word is conveyor belt. It is a noun, and it is a continually moving belt. So you're going to see these on a large scale, primarily in factories that are producing or manufacturing goods. Conveyor belt. And our last word is discriminate. It is a verb, and it means making assumptions based on skin color, way to dress, age, or social status. So you can discriminate someone in many different ways for being younger than you, for being older than you, because they wear dresses and you don't like dresses. Discriminate. Okay, let's review all of our words so far. So I'm going to say the word and you're going to repeat after me. Camshafts. Bicarbonate. Population. Census. Exaggerate. Principles. Miscellaneous. Economize. Soot. Wrench. Chamber. Conveyor belt. And discriminate. Before we read your chapters for today, let's review and talk about what happened in the last chapters. So Kate goes to the auction and she purchases 7,200 empty tubes for Rufus's birthday present. She didn't know she was buying that many. When the friends were using spoons to fill the empty tubes, they knew there must be a simpler way. So Rufus draws up a sketch of a machine, but it seems too complicated. Kate looks up the address of the company that went bankrupt, that the original tubes came from, that company. She thought if they had all these tubes, they must have had a machine that would fill the tubes as well. While Kate was trying to look through the windows of this building, a man asked her what she was doing. Once she explained what she was looking for, the man looked happy and surprised. He told Kate that there was a machine in that building that could fill her empty tubes, and he practically built it. So, let's see what happens next. Chapter 13, Hector and the Happy Lips Plant. The amazing thing about the tube filling machine was that it looked so much the way Rufus had imagined it would look. I showed Hector Rufus's drawing. Hector seemed to understand it right away. He'd need a gear wheel here and a 2-inch pipe feeding in here, Hector said. The pressure chamber wouldn't have to be so big, but he's got the right idea. The tube filling machine was the biggest piece of equipment in the plant. Then there were conveyor belts that carried the tubes to the tables where they could be packed for shipping. And there were storage bins for the stuff Happy Lips had used to make lip lotion. As the plant had looked run down from the outside, I was surprised at how neat everything was inside. The floors were swept and the tube filling machine looked as if someone had been polishing it every day. Hector said that when a company went bankrupt, it usually sold all its special equipment to help pay its bills. But the Happy Lips company owed the owner of the building so much rent that they had to leave him the tube filling machine in place of the rent. The owner thought it might be easier to rent the plant with all that good equipment in it, but the place had been empty for 6 months. And the owner, Hector said, was talking now about ripping out the tube filling machine and selling it for scrap metal. That would be a crime, Hector said. To destroy a beautiful machine like that, it would be a waste. Hector's like Rufus about not wanting to waste anything. Machines don't usually send me. But I could see how Hector felt about this one. It reminded me a little of that big piece of sculpture the Cleveland Museum had in the entranceway the last time I was there. The reason the tube filling machine was in such beautiful condition was that Hector had a key to the place. He came by a couple of times a week to see if the machine needed oiling or anything. Hector wanted it to be in perfect condition, ready to go on a day's notice, in case somebody came along to rent the place. The owner of the building was paying Hector a little to keep an eye on the plant, but Hector said it wasn't enough to live on, as he had 5 kids. He was almost broke, and his wife was bugging him to go into some other line of work. I tell her that would be a waste, he said, being I'm such a good mechanic. I know more about that machine than any mechanic in the United States, on account of my having practically built it and made a lot of improvements on it. If your friend rented the place and hired me to look after the machinery, Hector said, we could be in full production tomorrow, no problem. I could picture it. The tube machine filled with toothpaste, humming away, squeezing out thousands of tubes of toothpaste every hour. Hector working the machine, and Rufus and I and the other stockholders packing toothpaste and mailing it out to customers all over the United States. I couldn't wait to get home to tell Rufus. Hector said, I think the rent's only about $300 a month. Rent? I said. Oh, that brought me down to earth. $300 seemed like a lot. Of course, I realized you couldn't expect to get a factory with the machinery in it for nothing, and you certainly wouldn't fit a machine like that into our laundry room. Then there was Hector, too. I didn't think we could run the machine without him, and Rufus couldn't ask Hector to work like his friends for a share of the profits at the end of the year. Not when he was broke and had 5 kids to feed. And how much would you cost, Hector? I asked. I was getting $9,000 from Happy Lips, Hector said. I got to make at least $9,000 a year to pay my bills. So that would be $9,000 plus the rent. That might be okay if Rufus already had the profits from the first year of being in business, but of course he didn't. Then again, if Rufus couldn't figure out a plan for making millions, maybe he could think of some way to get only a few $1,000s. I told Hector I would have to talk it over with my friend. You bring him here, he said. I'll show him how everything works. I said I'd bring Rufus the next day. Just one question, Hector said, as I was getting on my bike. About Mr. Rufus. Would he discriminate? What do you mean? I asked. I mean about hiring me, Hector said. On account of I'm black. Oh, I said. Well, Rufus is too. He is? Hector said. More and more people you meet are, I said. I guess you're right, he said. Well, I'm glad to have met you, too. Riding home, I didn't know whether I'd done the right thing or not in going down to 29 Cuyahoga Avenue. I began to worry that maybe I'd gotten Hector's hopes up too much. My father's always saying that one thing leads to another. It certainly does. I start out to buy a friend a birthday present, and I end up trying to get him a factory to go with it and to find a job for a man with 5 kids. I never had that kind of problem in Fairhaven, Connecticut. Chapter 14, The Trouble with Adults. Rufus did think I was a little out of my mind when I told him I had found him not only a toothpaste machine, but a whole factory and mechanic to go with it. And he did wonder if we couldn't somehow get to use the machine without hiring Hector as well. I tried to explain that Hector and the machine seemed to belong together, and that I didn't think we could get one without the other. As soon as he met Hector, Rufus understood. As soon as Hector heard the details of Rufus's plan for keeping the price of toothpaste low and profits high at the same time, he thought it was a beautiful idea. "That Happy Lips lotion," Hector said. $1.98 a tube. Nothing in it but a little linoleum and a speck of perfume. To make it smell nice, maybe it made your lips feel nice, but it sure was a high-priced way to feel nice. Hector explained everything about the machine to Rufus, how many tubes it could fill in an hour, how many helpers Hector would need to turn out so many tubes. He and Rufus were talking as if it were all settled that Rufus was going to rent the plant. "It would be a shame not to," Rufus said on the way home. "We know we've got a good idea, and we've got all those tubes, now the machine and Hector. All we need is a little money." "Quite a lot, Rufus," I said. "So how much?" Rufus said. "Let's see. 9,000 for Hector, 3,600 for rent, and maybe a little more in case we have to buy some more tubes. I guess we'll need about $15,000. Okay, I want to stop right here for a minute because I want to talk to you about the time in this book and how much $15,000 would really be back in 1960. So you can see here there's 1960 and 2020. This is this year, and this is the year that the book is in. So in 1960, $15,000 is the equivalent of today $131,086.82. And so to figure this out, I used an inflation calculator to find the difference between the value of the money in the years. So that's a big difference. We're going to get back to the story. I just had to stop there so you can get an idea of how much money we're talking about back in 1960. "How are you going to get $15,000? I asked. "Just walk in a bank and ask for it?" "Hey," Rufus said, "why not? Isn't that what other people do?" "A stick-up, you mean?" I said. No, Rufus said. "I mean the way other businessmen do, the big businessmen." What Rufus decided to do was to go to Everybody's Friendly Savings and Loan and borrow some money. Everybody's Friendly Savings and Loan was the sponsor of the Joe Smiley Show. 5 times every night, this friendly Vice President Seymour Perkle interrupted the show to do a commercial telling how friendly Everybody's Friendly Saving and Loan was about lending everybody money to buy a car or start a business, and how they liked to encourage young businessmen who were starting businesses in the neighborhood, and how they believed in people, and how people were their business. The way Mr. Perkle made it sound, Everybody's Friendly Savings and Loan was dying to lend everybody money. So Rufus called up the office and asked for an appointment with Mr. Perkle. When we got to the office, the lady at the front desk didn't want to let us see Mr. Perkle. She said he had an appointment at 4 o'clock. Rufus said, "So do I. My name is Rufus Mayflower, and Mr. Perkle's 4 o'clock appointment is with me." The lady looked at an appointment calendar on her desk and said, "Oh, you're Mr. Mayflower." I don't think she expected Mr. Mayflower to look so young. She called into Mr. Perkle's office to tell him, "Mr. Perkle, there is a young man here to see you, and there is a young lady with him." I didn't care for the way she said young, as if Rufus and I were about 4 years old. But Rufus walked into Mr. Perkle's office as if he'd been borrowing money all his life. Mr. Perkle looked more tired than he did on TV and not as friendly. But he warmed up a little when I told him we saw him every night on the Joe Smiley commercial and that he was very good. "Ah," he said, "and what can I do for you?" "You can lend me some money for a business I'm starting," Rufus said. "Rufus was on the Joe Smiley show a couple of weeks ago," I said, as Mr. Perkle looked as if he needed a little more warming up. Joe Smiley said that he got a lot of listener response to that show, and Rufus got orders for 689 jars of toothpaste. "Ah," Mr. Perkle said to Rufus, "so that's where I've seen you. You're the boy who makes toothpaste." "Yes," Rufus said, He explained to Mr. Perkle that he now had 7,200 toothpaste tubes, a machine for filling them, and a man who knew how to run the machine, and that all he needed to get into production was about $15,000, which he could easily pay back in a year. Because within 1 year, he could easily be selling 250 million tubes of toothpaste. Rufus had written out on a piece of paper all the facts about the population of the United States and the 1-cent profit. Mr. Perkle went over Rufus's figures carefully. He couldn't find anything wrong with them. "You have a very good idea," Mr. Perkle said, "and you have figured everything out in a very businesslike way." "So can you lend me the money today?" Rufus asked. Mr. Perkle looked unhappy. "I'm afraid I can't lend you the money at all," he said. "How come?" Rufus said. "I thought you lent money to everybody." "Well, not exactly everybody," Mr. Perkle said. Not exactly, it turned out, meant not kids. The trouble with adults is that they never believe kids can do something even when they have good ideas. Mr. Perkle admitted that if a responsible adult with a regular job and no debts came to ask for a loan with the same idea Rufus had, he'd probably get the money. "I hope you understand," Mr. Perkle said. "It's nothing against you personally. It's just that you're, young. In your commercial, it says you encourage young businessmen," Rufus said. That stopped Mr. Perkle for a minute. Then he said, "Well, yes, we do, but what business experience have you had?" "Rufus has sold over 1,000 jars of toothpaste in 4 weeks," I said. "Ah," Mr. Perkle said. "And are you Mr. Mayflower's partner in business?" "She is a stockholder," Rufus said, which I thought was a very businesslike way to end the meeting. Chapter 15. An exception to the rule about adults. Having made the point about adults never believing kids can do anything, I have to take that back, or at least to admit there are exceptions. Hector, for example. What Rufus really felt bad about the afternoon we left Mr. Perkle's office was Hector. We'd have to tell him that we couldn't get the money. "It doesn't matter about us," Rufus said. "We can still make toothpaste in the laundry room, enough for our friends and families, but Hector really needs a job." And Hector was mad when we told him, furious. "Stupid, stupid, stupid," Hector said, stomping around the lot outside the factory. He was so mad he picked up a rock and heaved it against the wall of the factory. I thought at first he meant Rufus was stupid, or that he was stupid for believing Rufus could start a business, but he meant Mr. Perkle. "Because you had a good idea, kid," he said to Rufus. "$1 million idea. Just because you're only 12 years old doesn't mean it isn't a good idea. I've been in this business and I can tell you a good idea, and we've got the perfect machine for it. It's stupid to let that perfectly good machine stand there. It's a waste. It's a crime. It's stupid." "Hey," Rufus suddenly brightened up as if he had a $10 million idea. "Hector," he said, "I believe you. I believe you would lend me the money if you had the money, that is." "Believe me, I would," Hector said. "Great," Rufus said. "Then it's easy. All we've got to do, Hector, is for you to go to Mr. Perkle and ask him to lend you $15,000 to invest in a business." "Me?" Hector said. "You," Rufus said. Rufus turned to me. "Didn't Mr. Perkle say that if I were a responsible adult with a regular job and no debts, he would lend me the money?" "That's what he said," I said. "And you're a responsible adult, Hector," Rufus said. "Yeah," Hector said, "except I don't have a regular job, so how can I pay the money back?" "Simple," Rufus said. "I'm going to hire you as manager of the toothpaste factory. The money you borrow to invest in the business, I can use to pay your first year's salary, and to pay the rent, and to buy some more toothpaste tubes, which we will probably need." Hector scratched his head. "You mean I'm going to borrow the money, and I'm going to invest in your business so you can use it to pay me?" "Right," Rufus said, "but that's not all. For the $15,000 you invest in the business, I will give you 150 shares of stock in the company. At the end of the year, you will get part of the profits of the company because you will be a major stockholder." "A major stockholder?" Hector said. Rufus explained to Hector about the stock. That if Hector owned 150 shares of the stock, he'd own 15% of the business. And that if the company did make a $2.5 million profit, he'd get 15% of that, which would come to $375,000, Rufus said. That's more than enough to pay back the $15,000 to the Everybody's Friendly Savings and Loan. You sure you got that figured right, Rufus? Hector said. I told Hector we had checked out stockholders' profits in our math class. The whole class worked on it, and Mr. Conti checked the answers. Do it, Hector, I said. Go ask Mr. Perkle for the money. You mean I'd own part of the business? Hector said. Yep, Rufus said, and get paid every week, too. Oh, that would be beautiful, Hector said. Beautiful. There's just one question. Does this Mr. Perkle discriminate? I knew what Hector meant. As far as I know, just against kids, Rufus said. A year later, Hector said when he was being interviewed about Rufus on the Joe Smiley Show, maybe anybody can make toothpaste in his own kitchen, but speaking for myself, all I knew is one day I'm a mechanic out of work, and the next day I'm a general manager and a major stockholder, and that takes genius. Hector believed Rufus was a genius from the beginning. When Mr. Perkle okayed the business loan to Hector, Hector handed the $15,000 check straight to Rufus. Rufus put the money in a bank account and wrote Hector a check for his first month's salary. My father claims that one of the best proofs of Rufus's genius was his hiring Hector to run the toothpaste factory. Of course, I have to remind my father, I was the one who discovered Hector. The nice thing about Rufus is that he always does remember that it was me who found Hector and the toothpaste machine. The nice thing about Rufus is that he always does remember that it was me who found Hector and the toothpaste machine. All right, I hope you enjoyed those chapters. We have 2 more days of the Toothpaste Millionaire. Surprisingly, the book is coming to an end. I don't want it to end because I love reading to you guys. Here is your written response for today. Every time Hector meets someone, he always asks, do they discriminate? Why do you think Hector always asked this? And what would it be like to live like Hector? All right, guys, so I want to hear all of your unique thoughts. It's really interesting with these written response discussions because so many of you are giving me all your different perspectives, and I love it because then I get to hear all these different things on the same question, and it's just very insightful. And then you guys get to read each other's, and then you guys learn from each other. It's just really, really great discussion. And I'm really, really proud of how you guys have been participating with that. All right, I know you're going to do great on this. I'll see you next time, guys.